So, talking about some of the same issues and the same issues affecting the agricultural sector and the rural areas of the Central Valley. Now, Central Valley is obviously a lot less rural than, say, western portions of Nebraska and eastern portions of Iowa. But anyway, I'm going to be focusing a lot on what I did this morning on the Federal Reserve, but maybe bringing out some different issues associated with that. So that said, we're looking at the stimulus program, and I just want to talk about pedal to the metal. And I did talk about this, but I didn't talk about this morning and the money supply here. And here we go with the money supply. We'll look at that. You don't need an economist to tell you what's happened there. But more importantly, the question becomes for agriculture.
Ernie,
yes.
I don't think we see a screen share.
Wow. Okay, let me go back. Let me see that. Huh. Don't see a screen share. Wow. Okay. Huh. Wow, I don't know where are we here? I don't know why. I don't see that. Okay. Still no share there?
I have nothing online. If somebody wants to just put in the chat if they have anything. It may be me too. Let's see. No, you don't have a screen share.
No, I don't see a screen
Thanks,
share.
Pam. The bottom of your presentation, or the bottom of the Zoom meeting.
Yeah, I don't know. No, wait, there we go. Okay, I got a screen share now. Okay. Man, ooh, wow. That was,
There we go.
I'm sure it was painful, more painful for you than for me. But let's go back again. I'll flip through this. And again, I'm going to be talking about some of the same issues this morning, but hopefully focusing on it from a different direction. And as I said, we had pedal to the metal, I call it, the Federal Reserve. Now here is the short-term interest rates, which the Federal Reserve is raising next month. But, and here you see the money supply. Right there is the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. And here you see the growth and this growth. And here you see the 10-year treasury yield and the 1 month treasury yield, long and short term. But what I'd like to emphasize here, and as I said, I was a research faculty member with Cal State Fresno, joint appointments at Creighton and Cal State Fresno, and doing the issues. Agriculture is obviously important to both areas that we talked about, the 10 states that we survey here at Creighton University. And we survey bank CEOs in rural areas of 10 states. The average community size is 1,300. And we ask them, those bankers, about what's going on in their communities. And certainly it has to do with global economic conditions, but also the Federal Reserve and the money supply. Now, something I didn't talk about this morning is what's going forward, what's going to be going on going forward, what's the Federal Reserve going to be doing? They're going to be raising rates. Now, this is going to raise this short-term number here up to, we're going to see prime interest rates by the end of the year going from 3.25%, that's the current prime interest rate, to as much as 5%. Now, I don't think it's going to go to 5%. The bankers that we survey, some, there are 20%, think it could go as high as 5%. That would be 1.75% increase in the funds rate from where it is right now. And that would raise the prime interest rate. Of course, the cost of borrowing for these these farmers and those in energy as well. And here you see again, now what I didn't point out this morning, which I'd like to talk about now, is on the long-term side, and as not seen on this slide, I'd like to talk about is the fact that the Federal Reserve has monetized the debt. The federal government is running, we've had the Trump stimulus package and the Biden stimulus package, and then the impending and implemented infrastructure bill. All that has been supported to a large degree by the Federal Reserve monetizing the debt, of what we call it. Some now are calling it modern monetary theory. There's nothing modern and nothing theoretical about it. It's monetizing the debt, meaning the Treasury issues it and the Federal Reserve buys it. Now, how much have they bought? Well, we're now up to between $9 and $10 trillion on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. $9 and $10 trillion. Now, a portion of that, not insignificant portion of that, has come from mortgage-backed securities. Now, what they've done by March, and of course that's next month, they will have ceased buying them, and they're going to then let them mature. Now we'll have to wait and see if they allow them to mature, meaning instead of being stimulative, they will be contractionary. Instead of being stimulative, they'll be contractionary on the long-term side. So what does it mean to agriculture? What does it mean to the rural communities? It means higher long-term interest rates. It means higher mortgage rates. It means higher lending costs for farmers on the long end, not just on the short end. We're talking about operating costs for the farmer. The farmer's borrowing costs will be rising on the short end for operating, but also on the long end, you're talking about higher mortgage rates for farmland. That's very important going forward, and that's not a good signal, of course. Now, again, that said, as I pointed out this morning, agricultural income this year, net agricultural income, net farm income, will be reasonably good. It will not be as good as 2021. Why is that? Because the Federal Reserve, by tapping on the brakes, they were pedal to the metal. They had their foot on the gas pedal. Now they're going to be tapping on the brakes. And what that's going to do is, in my judgment, push up the value of the dollar, push down agricultural commodity prices to some degree, not significantly, but we're still seeing farmers facing these increasing input prices, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's transportation costs, but also interest costs. Interest costs are going to be going up. So for the farmers out there borrowing now, if it's available, borrow now, don't wait till later. And also in terms of these communities, the communities that we survey, the bankers are looking at higher interest rates. And what they're going to be doing is attempting, and of course, in these communities that we survey, the bank is central to the economic development of that area, that agricultural area. So what they're going to be doing, and in collaboration with other businesses in the area, is attempting to move the economy forward, even as interest rates are rising. That's long and short. Now, we were predicting, I was, and most economists predicting 1 percentage point increase in short-term rates by the end of the year. It's now up to 1.25, 1.5, but they're about 20% of the bankers expected to go to 1.75. That's funds rate. Now the prime rate is 3.25. So you add in 1.75 to that, you get an interest rate of 5% on prime. That's on prime. Of course, even higher for non-prime. So that said, I want to move forward now. The impact on agriculture, and here I want to show, this is our survey, and I didn't show this morning, and you'll see it. And I want to get to where I can see that better. This is the overall, the farmland and farm equipment sales index from 2017 to the latest number in 2022. That's February. 50 is growth neutral. So you look at this in January of 2017. Now that's what we're talking about there. And in terms of the farmland prices, you see up to 9, the index is at 90.0. That's January. It has dropped a bit for February. But think about that. We're seeing absolutely the highest pressure on agricultural land prices that we've seen ever, at least in our survey. We've been conducting it since 2006. But I think if you go back, this is going to be some of the highest pressures on agricultural land prices that we've seen in several decades, perhaps back 3 or 4 decades. And we're seeing in agricultural land prices there. But the white there, the white is in terms of farm equipment sales for the communities that we survey. Importantly, these retail outlets or outlets for the sale of agricultural equipment, very important for these communities, business communities, for there to be sales. And now the farmer is now buying again. Instead of holding off and doing repairs, they're buying again, and that's going to affect not only the rural areas that we're looking at, but also some of the urban areas where there are production facilities like in Omaha, Nebraska, where the agricultural equipment is being produced, and in, for example, Davenport, Iowa, or eastern Iowa. Now here's the overall index. I think I'll get that. Notice it's come down a bit, but look at all this. This is a phenomenal level of growth that we've seen. And what this has done for the agricultural sector is good in some ways, but not so good in others. And as the economist Herb Stein, chief economist for Nixon, said, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. And so those who are listening on this, I think if you're betting on buying farmland, I'm a little leery there. I think we're going to see it stop, some of the growth stop. I'm speaking of the growth ceasing. Now, what does that mean, the growth ceasing? That means that we're going to see some hurt on some of those individuals out there. The farmer is not in the business of selling land. The farmer, as we all know, is in the business of selling corn, wheat, soybean, livestock, pork or beef. So what we're talking about is rising also interest rates, but also in terms of their property taxes. And this is particularly issues in Nebraska and other states that don't, where most of the burden, local burden of, for example, schools, is paid for by the property tax. Very little support from the state government, and even less from the federal government. So again, a pinch. Now, I hate to be the bearer of such bad news. It's not bad news. It's just not as good for 2022 as what we had for 2021 and 2020. You see here what happened back here. This area I'm highlighting, or where my marker is circling, that's where the pandemic began. And you see what's happened since the pandemic began in terms of agricultural land prices, in terms of the overall ag economy, the rural economy, I should say, and then agricultural equipment sales. So it's been full steam ahead, and now we're hitting a bit of a bump in the road. And I'm a little concerned that you're having speculators, and what we see in our surveys is increasing ownership from non-producers. Okay, in other words, ownership from outside bidders, buyers, and we're seeing those of us who own some property, we're being inundated with bids to buy our property. Whether it's a home, whether it's land, it does not matter. We've got companies like BlackRock. We've got individual bidders, individual buyers, all the way from North Dakota and Minnesota in our district, all the way into south to Kansas and Missouri, all the way west to Colorado and Wyoming, and of course all the way east to Illinois and Iowa. We don't survey Indiana, but nonetheless, we're seeing this across the board, and there's significant risk now for those who are buying, because you're going to be buying at higher interest rates, and you're going to be paying, your costs are going up. Now, the land rental that I didn't talk about this morning, we're seeing some very strong growth in the rental prices. We're probably in our survey region, and it varies, of course, between Illinois and Iowa, where we're seeing stronger ag rental prices, where we're seeing probably in that area $250 to $300 per acre per year, up to South Dakota, North Dakota, which is significantly different, weaker than, out to Nebraska, where you're talking about irrigated land, irrigated in Nebraska, where you're seeing some stronger growth. But anyway, that's what we're seeing right now. And my argument here is this is being propelled by the Federal Reserve and a cheaper dollar. So ahead, now this is, as I said this morning, you've got economists on two sides, which is not unusual, that are betting on a higher value of the dollar and those who are on a lower value of the dollar. I'm on the high end. I believe we'll see the dollar rising, particularly, of course, against the yen. It's already done its business there. It's going to be on the yuan, the Chinese yuan, the euro as well. I'm expecting that. Now, it doesn't mean it'll happen, of course, but that's what we're seeing right now. And I invite your questions on that, of course. Now, growth in farmland, I went over this already. This but just this is unbelievable growth. This is year over year growth all the way. And whoops, sorry. Let me go back on that. Let me go back there. There you see from Illinois up to, and we're talking about Iowa there at 30%. Now that's remarkable in Iowa. Then that's a lot to do with northern Iowa, not as much in southern Iowa. And we're seeing in the district. Now this is from a survey of the Federal Reserve of the 7th District of the Federal Reserve, 22% overall. Again, just pointing to the increasing action by the Federal Reserve, which pushed the dollar lower, and boosted agricultural commodity sales price, the price, from say $4.50 a bushel to $6.50 a bushel, approaching $7 a bushel. Now, we haven't seen corn prices this high since 2013, when we also had a Federal Reserve that was intervening and pushing the dollar cheaper and prices higher. And land prices have accompanied that growth, and we've seen it. We're going to see it. Our agricultural, the farm rental prices of land are going to follow. We haven't seen as much growth there as we've seen in the price of land, but the actual price of land. But we're seeing that as well. And then looking at the picture driving this, of course, has been, in this case, we're talking about farm exports there, and farm exports as a percent of farm GDP. Now look at that. The yellow bar here, the yellow line there, is non-farm exports as a percent of non-farm GDP. Now, no surprise there that we're talking about a much higher percentage number for the farm sector, the ag sector. And notice it's turned down here a bit this year because of course, the pandemic. And that's in 2020 to 21. And that's downturn. We don't have the latest numbers, haven't seen the latest numbers. Here, looking at the two high points that would be 15.4%. That's of course indicating that non-farm exports as a percent of non-farm GDP, 15%. Then you go to the agricultural sector, farms, 115%. That's so the point here is, and I hammered it home, hopefully I did this morning, that the farm sector is much more dependent on what happens at the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve has an impact on, of course, the value of the dollar and the globalization pushing up farms. But look at this back to 1967 here. Look at this. But it's been growing, and you don't need an economist to tell you that the farm sector is now much more dependent on sales abroad. And so likewise, the farm sector is more dependent on infrastructure to support those sales. In other words, think of the backlog that you're now seeing in the ports of Long Beach and LA, and how much of that's related to I don't know what to call it, but the transportation in and out of the port, but also the port itself, and the need for federal involvement, in my judgment, to support that. And I'm not that familiar with the infrastructure bill that was passed last year by the Biden administration, passed by the Congress and signed by the president. I would hope that a large proportion of that, or a significant proportion of that, goes toward the ports, not just the ports on the west and east coast or New Orleans, but also certainly down the Mississippi River, and supporting trade. But again, the globalization and what that means, of course, and I haven't seen a TV today, so I don't know what's going on in Ukraine or what's not going on in Ukraine, but that shakes those reverberations. And it's not, the public at large is not, they're not cognizant of that. By that, I mean the dependence. I mean, they're saying, well, you live in Iowa, you live in Nebraska, you live in Southern Illinois. You're not affected by what goes on in Ukraine or what goes on in China and what goes on in Taiwan. Well, you are, we are, we're seeing it. And I think we need to hammer that home. And as far as the public at large, and I've had this question, and please, if you're in ag, I mean, I'm insulted by the comment, but usually I'll get a New York person media, and I don't mean to pick on New York media, but they'll say, well, you in your presentation, do you really think farmers really understand all this? And I think, yes, they do. I mean, I only teach supply and demand. Farmers live supply and demand. And we need to bring that home to the public, but bring it home to legislators as well, how important exports are to the agricultural sector, but how important it is to the midsection of the country, but also, of course, to areas like the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Valley of California. And also, given this, and I don't have a slide to support this, but the importance of immigration. I'm talking about legal immigration. We have to sensitize, in my view, sensitize this issue to the man and woman, the voter, of how important and how much we depend on these individuals to grow our economy. And as I said in my presentation this morning, I'm working with I just finished up with work on a meat packing plant in North Platte, Nebraska. But the real resistance there was from the community, some resistance to bringing in workers from other parts of the nation, other parts of the world. We as economists, we as policymakers, we as political scientists, we as economic development directors need to hammer home to our population, to our people, that these men and women, boys and girls that are coming into our school system are supportive of this economy that we love, we cherish, and this economy. So again, we're seeing this, I won't call it a collision. It's not a collision. It's a coming together of the inputs, which is immigration, and the outputs, which is sales abroad. To that end, I think we also need to understand and convey to everyone that the black swan events, and I had this on one of my slides, and I've had it there for a year. Now, when I put this up originally, I was even a little leery to even put it up and put it on a slide. And it said, the black swan for the agricultural sector was China doing reconnaissance and flyovers to Taiwan. Now, today, that's more realistic than a year ago when I posted that, when I originally put it up. And that's true today. It's more so, it's a bigger issue going forward, and we have than Russia invading or moving into Ukraine, as they did into Crimea, part of Ukraine at the time, and that this is telegraphed back to the rural communities. It's telegraphed back by lower agricultural commodity prices. It's telegraphed back by land prices softening. But right now, again, we're seeing a pretty good outlook. Now, not as good of an outlook as we had in 2021, but looking ahead. But again, we're just subject to the volatility in the global economy. And that's when my family and I moved to Nebraska in 1992. Of course, that's 30 years ago. It's changed, and it's changed dramatically in that period of time. And what we've had is a remarkable period of time. And we look at it, and what we've seen overall is just increasing dependence on the global economy. And looking at what I call the correlation coefficients. Now, those who are familiar with these understand that these correlation coefficients are -1 for two factors that move in opposite directions. Okay, and of course, the smallest number is a -1, meaning they move perfectly opposite, and then +1 means they move in tandem right together, like centigrade and Fahrenheit temperature. And money supplies lagged by about 6 months farmland prices, and that correlation coefficient's 0.95. Now that's remarkable. Now, I'm not contending that a correlation coefficient tells you everything. It doesn't. I mean, there are many factors other than the money supply, but I would argue that the money supply has contributed to that very high correlation coefficient. And that's 2017 to 2022, January. Money supply and farm equipment sales, look at that. So, and again, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, is going to be cutting back on the money supply growth. They've got to. M2 money supply, that's the currency plus the checking accounts plus marketable securities. We're talking about almost $22 trillion. That's grown from about 17 trillion. I think the number, I may not have these numbers quite correct. 17 trillion, 17 plus trillion in 2000 and beginning of the pandemic. So money supplied overall rural economy 0.57. So it's not just the money supply for the rural economy. We've got other things going on there, of course, but the non-rural, the non-ag portion of that. But the ag portion, very dependent. And what we're seeing in certain parts of the rural economy is an attempt to diversify and to diversify in some cases away from ag. I remember years ago, Governor Branstad of Iowa said we've got to diversify, and I live in neighboring state, Nebraska, but we got to diversify and move out of ag, not move out of ag. What he was saying, move into adding something that's not connected to ag. Well, that hasn't really happened, but luckily for Iowa and luckily for many states, being in ag has been a good deal. Now in Iowa and many parts of the region that we survey, we were talking about renewable energy. Now I'm including in here ethanol. Nebraska is number one in ethanol production. Number two is Minnesota. Number three is Nebraska. So again, ethanol production, wind energy. Iowa is one of the leading states, Texas as well. But wind energy, solar energy, we're talking about gearing up for solar. We're going to see Iowa really moving ahead in solar energy production in the months and years ahead. And of course, the federal government is incentivizing that, and we're seeing it. So the lack of diversification in the past could be, certainly will be, a big plus. Now, again, a big plus, but I guess one could say, well, this is diversification of ag, and I think that is correct. In other words, embracing renewable energy. We're looking at, I'm working with a company here, a very good company in Des Moines, Eco Engineers. And what they're providing is anaerobic digestive systems for the ag sector. And those are small projects, but in some, they're big impacts. And we're going to see that as well. Again, we're seeing it in terms of new food production, food processing. As I said, I work with a company in North Platte. Now I'm working with a food processing company. Did I hear something there?
Got a couple minutes, and then we have a couple questions. I just want to give you time to.
Oh, am I running out of time?
Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes. So you got 2 or 3 minutes, and then we've got a couple questions.
Okay, thank you for warning.
Opportunity.
Sorry for going on. I get excited about this. Working with a company now, another food processing plant in Iowa that's going to be they're going to be processing 1,400 cattle per day, and it's going to be environmentally friendly, much more than we've seen in the past. So as President Biden has talked about the monopoly, not a monopoly, but the 4 biggies, we're now going to be seeing more and more, and that's very positive for the rural economy. So I'm excited about that. 2022 is going to be looking not as good as for the rural economy, not as good as 2021, but it's still going to be positive, long-term, very positive, I think. And I'll move to this, but I'll look at this change in the value of the dollar during this period. So what I'm connecting here is the money supply, the value of the dollar and exports, and then of course, rural economic development. And you see there, all these currencies, except for the Mexican peso, declined in value, supported agricultural production, and that's what we saw, exports. Look at that, amazing, amazing. Then I'll try to, there's the deficit. And here's that money supply again, the conclusions. Federal Reserve activist policies differentially impact agriculture, no doubt about it. But also, again, back to the renewable energy, I think that's going to be very good for agriculture in the rural communities. Again, those that take advantage of it. The linkages of value of the dollar in international trade. And I put here agricultural farmland prices is a rising issue for rural Main Street simply because right now, immediately it's going to be higher property taxes, and that's going to pinch some of the in the agricultural sector. And with that, I'll just cease right there and take questions.
Good, thank you. We have one from Pamela.
Okay.
Can you see comparisons to the early mid 80s when there was a farm crisis and mortgage rates up to 12%?
Okay, mortgage, a crisis, definitely no. Definitely no. Now, why not? Definitely no, because bankers are not overextending. Even though the agricultural land prices have increased significantly, farmers have not borrowed against that rising equity, nor have the bankers lent into it. So I don't expect the crisis for that reason. Secondly, I don't expect interest rates to rise to that level either. When I say higher interest rates, I remember the mortgage rates rose to 16% during portions of that period. I don't see it this time. Now, if the Federal Reserve should fail to act, meaning increasing interest rates, it could get out of hand. We could have spiraling inflation, and it could be interest rates rising to that level. I don't expect that to happen. I think there's one thing we've actually learned a few things from observing history, economic history, certainly. Other questions?
This is a question for me. So with, I actually work with the Small Business Development Center. So we're working with small businesses in the towns, if you will, in the rural areas. How will the slowdown in activity affect the towns? If I have a restaurant that I want to helping someone open up in the town, is now the time to do that? Is there a point where it just doesn't make any sense because of what may happen in the future?
I think it's going to be good. And what's happening now, meaning not as good as what we've seen necessarily in the past. But to your point, James, the number one issue for these businesses is finding and hiring qualified workers, getting workers. So the pandemic has pushed workers out of the workforce because of the fear of coming in and contracting COVID-19. Secondly, childcare. Childcare is an issue in rural areas as in urban areas, keeping individuals out of the workforce. And third is that's not as much of an issue in rural areas, is the idea that some individuals are remaining out of the workforce simply because they're getting support from the federal government or state government or local government. It's not as big an issue here. So going forward, if you can get those workers, and again, I go back to my initial statements, I think if we will embrace legal immigration, I'm not speaking of illegal immigration or whatever you wish to call it. I'm talking about legal immigration, whereby we can bring these men and women in from other nations. I think we can grow those economies. I mean, there's much more of a willingness to move from other portions of the world into extreme North Dakota, where the weather's even colder than it is here in Des Moines today, or than it is to get somebody to move from Rochester, New York. I mean, there's a bias, unfortunately, and I think fortunately, immigrants aren't as biased as many of us are in terms of this portion of the country. We Midwesterners, and I didn't grow up here, but I've lived here so long now, I am one. We don't make a very good case for why you should move to this part of the country. So in terms of those developments, back to your question, James, I think there's every reason to believe that we can do it here. Now, let me give you an example. I work with Hamilton Telecommunications, a company in Aurora, Nebraska, that provides telephone services for the hearing impaired. They do it for across the nation. They do it right there from not all of it from Aurora, but they do a lot of it from Aurora. So leadership in these communities, James, is going to be central. In other words, the community that thrives like Aurora, then it dies like some other communities, is going to be a lot to do with leadership, but also the willingness to accept international workers from other parts of the nation, other parts of the world. And you find, as I said earlier, I was a faculty member, a research faculty member at Cal State Fresno. There's a whole different attitude in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, Fresno, and the outlying areas to immigration there than in this part of the country. And I work with a company in northern Iowa, also a South Korean company. And the CEO, in talking to him, his one issue was somewhat, he just didn't feel in part of the community. We have to be, it's our responsibility to make these international companies that might move here more comfortable. In this case, again, a South Korean company that's working with, in this case, it was ADM, I think it was, that they were working with in collaboratively in northern Iowa. And that has been very positive for that company. So I'm very positive, James, for communities that gets their leadership together, gets their bankers together, and moves ahead, understanding some of the issues with the volatility. You're going to, unfortunately, it is a more volatile world.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. If you would like to say any parting words, or we can end this and give everybody a few extra minutes to collect themselves and go on to the next session.
Well,
about
maybe if I can tell a story. How's that? A little short story.
Perfect.
And I was in the military. I was at U.S. Navy, and I was flew in these. Many of you may remember or seen the P-3A Orions, 4-engine turboprop with a magnetic anomaly detection, that stinger on the back. Well, the Navy sent me to aircrew training in Norfolk, Virginia. And my parents took me down. I lived in North Georgia. They took me down to Atlanta to get a train to go to Norfolk. And those who are familiar, well, I'm not sure today, but at that time, the train did not go to Norfolk. It went to Portsmouth. And Portsmouth and Norfolk are separated by a tunnel. So I'm fretting about how I'm going to get to my aircrew training. I was doing aircrew training. First of it was in Norfolk. And as you know, when you're late for a job at Creighton University, they wish you didn't do that. In the military, they can put you in the brig. That's called AWOL. So I was fretting it. So I'm in a Burger King, sitting there and worrying how I'm going to get there. And this gentleman said, "I'll take you." So we get in his car and we're going, as you may know, at that time, the Portsmouth and Norfolk were separated by a tunnel. We're going underneath the tunnel. And I turned to him and I said, "How do you know I'm not a serial killer?" And he turns to me, he says, "You know what the probabilities are of 2 serial killers being at this car, at this time being in this car, at this very place?" I'm like, "Okay, I got you." And there is a point to that. An economic point to that is that most things are not 0 probability. Most things are not 100% probable. They're somewhere in between. And what we have to do, particularly in rural areas, is evaluate those probabilities. And I would ask, what is the probability that China will, what we used to call when I was in school, mainland China, it's no longer mainland China, but China does flyovers and reconnaissance around Taiwan. That is telegraphed back here. And again, also my concern, I haven't had a TV on today and haven't looked, but what are President Biden's plans for restrictions on trade, and is there retaliation? I'm very concerned about that retaliation and what it means for this part of the country and how it affects small businesses and big business in what we call rural Main Street. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it.